can I ask you, can you hear me? Darren, can you put on your speakerphone, please? Your speaker is still off.
We there?
Yes. Yes, there we go.
Finally.
Yes.
Yeah, maybe didn't get your first 10 seconds, but I got the rest of it. So,
yes.
Yeah.
So I think, thank you, Darren, for being on the platform. And I'm happy to have you here on this Optimal CPD platform. And we're looking forward in sharing knowledge and empower the individuals on the platform to learn more about ACL injuries and maybe a different angle for what we normally do. So, but first, to start off, can you tell us a bit, what are you currently doing and where are you?
Okay, yeah. I'm currently spending all of my time at home and have done for the last 6 weeks, as many people probably are as well. I'm in a position where it's been a while since I've actually spoken to anyone. So excuse me if I forget a few words here and there. But I'm over in Qatar in the Middle East. I work at Aspetar Sports Medicine Orthopedic Hospital. My role in Aspetar is strength and conditioning, exercise physiology. I've held kind of different positions within Aspetar, working with some of the youth athletes in terms of fitness testing and monitoring and training, working with a host of international athletes of different sports, and more recently, over the last 2 to 3 years, assisting with the ACL group, particularly the gym-based and the field-based reconditioning, testing, monitoring, etc. So managed to put my feet into different areas within the hospital. We've got a lot going on. Currently involved in some of the research as well, which is interesting. But generally, my background is S&C, is exercise physiology and coaching as well. So just to kind of make that clear from the outset, it's not from a physio's perspective. So there might be some different thought processes and different sort of concepts and ideas, but hopefully that can stimulate a bit of thought and a bit of discussion.
Yes, I think always Dr. Holstjousen taught me that when you call someone to the party or to a meeting, then you need to call someone that think different than with the way you are thinking. And that's why we call you from Optimal CPD. Is I like your alternative way of thinking, because that elaborates on the bigger picture of ACL injury and reconstruction and conditioning. So that's what I like from you. So to jump into your article, the cognitive function and perception and other similar words that you've used in your article may be relatively new to the group that we're working, or that is currently on our platform. Can you please in a short description describe why these words, and can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, it stems a lot from the sports psychology side of things. As a practitioner myself, I do try and get involved in different areas, and being fortunate enough working in Aspetar, we do have access to a lot of different disciplines. Cognitive function is essentially looking at mental abilities, mental capacities, thinking more so from the brain's perspective. And from that, we can then disseminate it and dissect it into things like perception, what we're viewing and what we're looking at. Could be things like decision making. It could be things like anticipation, pattern recognition, things like changing your perspective of where you're looking at. So it's more of a visual focus. And despite my background in physical elements, physical components, I do see a need for us to kind of really broaden our horizon, not only in ACL, but a lot of aspects of training and conditioning to better understand these different elements and how they might contribute to what we do and how we do it.
Yes, okay. And then why do you consider perception and cognitive function as a risk factor for injury, Darren?
Yeah, well, there's been a bit of work in different areas, and it's been really trying to pull those areas together and better understand what we're actually dealing with. And to sort of touch upon some of the research out there, if we look at, I think it's Walden's work in 2015 in their review, BJSM, looking at the 3 mechanisms in terms of ACL injury, and one of those was change of direction. And we're probably in large agreement that change of direction is a risk factor, is a cause for ACL injuries, knee valgus and certain kinematics changing during that particular movement. But it's really kind of backtracking and understanding how we get into that position and how we ended up there. And we look at change of direction, but it's not simply left at that. We can't just simply say, oh, it was the cutting action, it was the change of direction. Let's understand the context within that situation and what was happening. So, for example, I'll call upon, I think it was Brothy in 2015, an article in Sports Health, and they looked at defending actions in football players, in soccer players. And that can be applied to a lot of other sports as well. And showing that defending actions were a greater cause of injuries than attacking actions. So when you're responding to an individual, when you're having to be reactive to someone else's movements, when you are indecisive, when you don't have the solutions and you're becoming reactive, it kind of causes more problems to the body. So within that as well, what they also looked at, what was interesting, is the cataloguing of those injuries as well. And they showed that while I think off the top, 82% were classified as non-contact injuries. Okay, but what they also found was that there was an individual opponent in close proximity to that individual when that injury occurred. So if we just look at it solely for what it is, we think, well, there's no contact there. There's no external impact or anything. Yet when we actually look at it and break it down a bit closer, we start to see, well, actually there's someone in close proximity. And we start to sort of think, well, what else is there? Some of the research, I can't remember the author, but in softball players, they did a video analysis of ACL injuries, and they showed that more often than not, that the incidence of ACL occurred whilst their vision was taken away from their action. So, you know, the sport of handball being, they might be jumping up and they might be taking their vision away, maybe pretending a fake. And at that point, when they land or when they change direction, that's when the ACLs were occurring as well. So you kind of start to dissect it more and more. And we think, well, yeah, there's a change of direction, but let's think about what actually happens in and around that change of direction. I kind of like to refer and give an example of Mario Kart, the game. I'm sure we've all played or come across the game on the computer. Now, if you're playing that game on your own and you're driving along on the roads and there's no distractions, and the road is simple, there's no sort of falling off the edge or anything like that, more often than not, you don't die, you don't fall off, and you're able to complete the race and get there in a good time. When you have your friends over and when you're competing, and when your friends are, say, Luigi and Toad and Yoshi and everyone else, and they're throwing banana skins and bombs at you and everything else, you then start to lose a lot of that focus, and you start to have incidences where you're falling off the edge, you're crashing into other people, you're spinning on the banana skins. So those elements that have been added to that situation have just complicated what you're having to deal with. So it just becomes much more complex, rather than simply the instance of a change of direction. You know, and I think it was Swanika, maybe it's about 5 years ago, in a nice paper in the Journal of Athletic Training, I believe, saying that ACL injuries largely come from a high element of cognitive function, and neural aspects is a big component there. It's just unfortunately we've untapped that area.
Sure. Darren, then these parameters in these areas are whole perception and cognitive function. Why do you think that it's been neglected in the research and so little is known about it? Is it not a popular area, or is it difficult to assess? Can you give us a bit more feedback on that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think it's just poorly understood, and that's for a number of reasons. One being those points that I've just mentioned in terms of classifying it. You know, we tend to bracket these things quite categorically into contact, non-contact, change of direction. I think it's got so many more layers than that. So in terms of how we're classifying it, so already we're missing a large number there in terms of how it's classified. Excuse me. We then also look at things like testing. So pretty much to date, the testing of change of direction has been, it lacks a lot of elements, if I'm honest. You know, so if we look at Berge's review, I think maybe 2018-19, and looking at criteria in terms of ACL rehab, what they highlighted is that there was a large dominance of strength-based testing, but I think only 4 studies or fewer included some element of change of direction testing. Now, just to kind of classify the 2 components, or the 2 sort of elements of what we're talking about, the change of direction will be performing a cutting task, but with no external stimuli, no response. You don't have to look at something and respond. That change when it becomes unplanned and we have to react to something. So when we have to perform the movements in response to a stimuli, there are big differences to how that's performed compared to solely a change of direction. So I mean, if I was to run and do a 45-degree cut that is planned, that I know where I'm going and how I'm going to execute that. Now, if I compare that to if I'm running forward and I have to react to yourself, Arnold, saying left or right and perform the same cut but under a reactive element, they're 2 different components. They might seem very minute and small simply because you're only saying left, right, or given a direction. Yet a lot of, a good amount of research by the likes of Basir and Lee, etc., have shown biomechanical profiles, kinetics, kinematics, EMG to differ between those 2 movements, even if between those two movements, even though the action is exactly the same. So we're looking at, as I say, classifying. We're looking at a lack of research in that area. Myself and colleagues have published last year a review highlighting that. And what the studies have done previously has been solely change of direction actions. So it might be a T-test where you run up and you go side to side. It might be an Illinois test where it's just pretty much round cones and then back. So these actions and these movements are very pre-planned, very, I would say, basic in nature. Now that totally goes against what we know sport to be. We know that within football, within netball, with any sports, there are constant decisions to be made, constant searches in terms of your visual actions. So what am I looking at? Am I looking at a teammate or an opponent? How am I looking in terms of where the ball is? Where am I receiving it? So all these add to the complexity. Unfortunately, a lot of the research has been lab based. So it really takes down that sense of reality. It's reduced that ecological validity, so we can get reliable data, we can get some pretty impressive analysis with some of the equipment, but it really takes it out of that environment. So we then lose more information. In terms of field-based, we still don't yet have the equipment to allow to accurately monitor and test within the field, and even the test protocols, those in themselves are not very well designed at the moment. So there's so many different layers. So with that, it almost becomes easier just to neglect it, because we don't know enough about it. Simply, we'll get you strong. It just seems a lot of the stuff at the moment is solely looking at getting our individuals strong. Now, that's not me as a strength and conditioning coach negating the importance of being strong, but I've also seen a lot of strong individuals suffer ACLs and other injuries. And this is not solely talking about high-end athletes. This model can be applied to recreational individuals that I'm sure a lot of people are working with, because it's all relative. They might not have these capacities, these physical, technical, cognitive capacities. And you could even then further apply it to the elderly population, because those capacities of cognitive function are also diminished later in life. You start to lose this ability to anticipate, you start to lose this ability to react quickly, and you'll probably see that in a lot of practices where the exercise is performed slowly, and once an external stimuli is included, the ability to execute that movement is massively impaired. I suppose I would draw upon some of the dual tasking research when I refer to that, particularly in the elderly. There's a lot of research in that area. So when someone's doing a task, a physical-based task, and you've got a cognitive component, a cognitive demand, then the ability to execute that physical task is diminished based off that cognitive demand. So, there's lots of elements to it. And it's that inability to really kind of hone in on that information. I'll just very quickly just draw upon one more piece of research, was the Ender King's recent work looking at ACLs, and they interestingly found that when we're looking at solely performance measures, i.e. time, that those can be regained, I think, within the 9-month period post ACL. Yet when you're looking at limb differences in terms of executing a change of direction, ACL deficient, there still remains issues in terms of biomechanical profiles. So they're still deficient executing that movement, kinetics, kinematics, despite their ability to perform well on the time test. Their movement mechanics within that is impaired. So, yeah.
I think, can we move on to what is a snapshot from you, a take-home underlying model that practitioners might consider implementing in their practices? So I think now we're digging into the stuff that I think the practitioners really want to know, how they can take some of these information, this article, and actually go and start to implement it.
Yeah. It's always not that easy, straightforward, but there's a lot to it, I'm sure. But I would encourage practitioners to, in the same way, physical training or other elements, to understand sort of key principles. And I would stick with basic 3 kind of three considerations, so almost like a triangle, and that would be the individual, the task, and the environment. And those three can work as constraints. So what I mean by that is that you can modify the individual's physical, cognitive capacity by challenging them. Like I say, it could be by giving them some visual distractions. It could be by giving them dual task elements. So that's looking at the individual. The task, we could, by modifying the objective of the task, it could be looking at the space that you might be working in. Even something as basic as that, reducing the confines of the space and the distance, etc. Just modifying those elements can give individuals a different challenge. And the environment, and within that environment, what we've got a list of, say for example, the football would be the opponents, your teammates. So even something like including a bit of competition. You could have two individuals maybe at a similar stage in their rehab, and you include an element of competition in an exercise, and you constrain one of those elements, whether it's the individual's capacity, whether it's the task, or whether it's the environment. And you'll see a number of things, usually a bit more sort of focus from the individual. When there's a competition in there, you suddenly get people a bit more focused on what they have to do. They also have a bit more enjoyment. And when there's a bit of enjoyment, a bit of more focus, you're able to execute maybe the task with a bit more emphasis. So those are the three elements that I would encourage individuals to look at. Always have a checklist in their mind.
Can I ask a question, Darren?
Yeah.
So doing, say, for instance, a ladder drill and counting backwards, you understand that that's a cognitive challenge. Or using uneven numbers, counting backwards, or maybe at a certain color change, switch to a different number range, like 1,000 or 100. Do I interpret it correctly? That's a cognitive challenge.
Yes, it is. It is. What I would say about that is that we then need to, and it's a nice example, and I think it's a commonly used approach. And it's not me saying that isn't a good approach, because it does challenge. And I'm sure people have experienced when you do a ladder drill on its own, and then a ladder drill with adding that objective of recalling numbers, etc. Then you might see alterations in, again, the mechanics. The important part is effectiveness versus efficacy. And what we mean by that is it could be an effective exercise for achieving what you want it to achieve in that particular instance. The problem is transfer to what happens in the game or what happens in the sport. And that only happens when the stimulus is compatible with an appropriate response. So it's a case of trying to make those things resemble some of the sporting actions a bit closer, because that's what's going to improve those cognitive functions, improve those cognitive capacity, rather than solely, I would say that was kind of first level approach. And it's common for sure, but I think that's where the downfall becomes, is that when we get back into returning to sports, quite often those individuals don't have a lot of time before they may be thrown back into competing, or they may be thrown back into playing, or they might want to return to playing with their friends or playing a game. And that gap of challenging their cognitive function has probably been, it will probably be too short because it's not being challenged enough during the rehab. They don't have enough time. Usually the time frame of that period returning to play is not enough for them to retrain that. It's just like any other capacity, just like any other component. Physicality, we reduce that, we need to improve that.
Can
So it would probably...
Can I throw in something from a rehabilitation perspective? I think, as you say, that's maybe a level 1 approach, and that can be maybe suitable for introducing that maybe earlier in rehabilitation, so that we can have a seamless integration of this cognitive aspect, while we maybe lean over to more the majority of the rehab towards more a strength training component, but we bring in some cognitive challenges.
Indeed.
Maybe in an unstable environment, or maybe
and that could be
focus of teach these people that actually to focus on specific components, that you get the cognitive component early in the rehabilitation being incorporated. So when these people move over to their secondary final phase rehabilitation, return to sport competition, then it's not new to them. They are already being challenged, if I can put that, not on the level that you want, but on the level that actually can
at least there's been foundations put in place, and that can start very early. If we look at cross effect training, with an injured limb, we've seen some research that training the other limb, there might be some crossover effect. Now that could be something that we also include in terms of using cognitive function for that limb. Just get them into those good habits of responding to a stimulus, and like you say, thinking about different layers that we can take that before they return to their sport or their activity.
Yeah, so I think to wrap this up is for the clinicians on this platform tonight is actually, I think in myself I'm challenged, because I'm falling in a rut also sometimes, as proprioceptive training, then there's a strength training component, there's a bit of plyometric training, but how we actually can incorporate cognitive challenges in this early phases, and what we can do maybe in strength training to highlight this cognitive and perception behaviors, while we still apply the right stimulus. Well, because I think we need to stay and keep the end in mind, but don't be scattered and try to cover all your stops, because then you're going to give a rehabilitation program with a lot of exercises that not leading up to something. So it comes back maybe to more a phasic approach, and it comes back to when are we going to do what while we keep the end in mind. I think that's the bottom line, that we need to ask the question and do a bit of reverse engineering.
Indeed, yeah.
What is the demands on cognitive level? What is the demands on strength training level? And
because just to touch upon that very quickly, when you talk about strength level, I've done a review in sports medicine, and the strength contribution to reactive agility, when you have to respond to it, is far less compared to just simply change of direction. Change of direction, remember, is a physical based. Reactive is where you have to respond to the stimulus. So you can have your eccentric, concentric, isometric strength that does contribute and improve change of direction as a physical component solely. But the contribution of eccentric, concentric, isometric strength has shown to be significantly lower when there's that cognitive element in there. So if we think of that in terms of their return, if we're reducing that element, if we don't have that enough, we don't have enough capacity, then they may be somewhat underprepared going into whatever they're returning to.
Okay, Darren, I think everybody is waiting for our president. Let's go talk to the country. and that's going to give us feedback on where are we going for the next month or two.
You're not telling me this was more important, Arnold. Is that what you're saying?
Keep the main thing here. It's 9:30. So I think, Darren, thank you very, very much. It was very informative, and I really want to elaborate on the fact that I think we need to upskill ourselves in terms of the cognitive component. Although there is not a lot of research not been done in that environment, it's not to say that it's not important. I think we need to be mindful of the fact that there is such a component, and that how we actually can incorporate that into how we do our rehabilitation and set up our rehabilitation modalities, and how we actually can bring that in. So I actually you can follow Darren on his Instagram profile. He's got a lot of nice exercises there. And thank you, Darren, for thinking out of the box. We like it. And thank you for being an alternative thinker. That's what I like from you, is you challenge the status quo. And yes, thank you for everybody. We're looking forward to see you next week for our, we hope, the last week in our lockdown but not locked up series, in the 5-week series. And we believe that we're going to slowly go back, but it depends on Senator Ramaphosa. And remember, what I've seen in this is there's a lot of interest. So I believe we're going to go on with it in the future, but maybe once a month. Then we're going to do some article discussions and get some international presenters or authors of the various articles to come and talk to us. And that is all to build a community of clinical experts by changing informative learners to transformative leaders. So that is the vision of this platform, and this is why we do what we do. So thanks for everybody. Thank you for tuning in, and hopefully we will see you next week.